Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council Provisional Rules of Procedure, the Presidency of the Security Council invites the representative of Egypt and Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the provisional rules of procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There is no objection. It's so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Mr. Tom Fletcher, Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, and Ms. Bisan Natil, Tamer Institute for Community Education. It is so decided. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a statement. I give them the floor.
Mr. President, we have just approved the list of briefers for this meeting. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that Ms. Catherine Russell, the Executive Director of UNICEF, is absent from that list. Her participation was requested by our delegation and supported by the Algerian presidency. We are grateful to you, Mr. President, for your efforts and the efforts of your delegation undertaken, as far as we know, to convince Ms. Russell to brief us. However, she refused to do so. As far as we can tell, she used a thought-up pretext for doing so without putting forward any weighty arguments for her refusal. Similarly, almost mythically, other representatives of UNICEF's leadership were also unavailable. The refusal of UNICEF's head to brief the Security Council about the horrific tragedy linked to the death of tens of thousands of children in Gaza is a flagrant step which deserves our most serious censure. I'd like to remind you that Ms. Russell, during the U.S. presidency of the Security Council, came to brief us at the drop of a hat at a disgraceful, politicized briefing about the so-called children's aspects of the situation in Ukraine on the 4th of December of last year. So it would appear that for UNICEF, children in Gaza are less important than children in Ukraine. Otherwise, how can we explain the fact that UNICEF deems it unnecessary to brief the Security Council about the situation surrounding these children, which, by the way, is the mandated activity of the fund? Clearly, the fate of these children is of no concern neither to Ms. Catherine Russell nor to the U.S., of which she is a national. After all, the U.S. presidency, despite our numerous calls, never did convene a Security Council meeting on children in Gaza in December of last year. Clearly, our U.S. colleagues are uncomfortable commenting the situation surrounding the deaths of tens of thousands of children in this strip, deaths which, to a large extent, they themselves provoked, casting a veto on 6 occasions, not letting the Security Council to intervene and stop the Israeli slaughter. And the head of UNICEF played along with the US on this issue. We see this as being a flagrant violation of Article 100 of the UN Charter. Ms. Russell, in this situation, was behaving as a US citizen, not an impartial UN staffer. We're grateful to Mr. Fletcher, who, despite his very busy schedule, in contrast to Ms. Russell, found the time to attend despite receiving an invitation at the 11th hour. We value his availability, yet OCHA's mandate, in contrast to that of UNICEF, is not focused on monitoring the situation surrounding children. Therefore, Mr. Fletcher, unfortunately, cannot fully replace a briefing that Ms. Russell could have provided us with. We will be drafting a letter to the SG post-haste so that he takes measures to avoid such disgraceful situations in future. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. And on behalf of the United States, I would reject the accusations put forward by the representative of the Russian Federation. I will be speaking later on behalf of my government with respect to the situation of children in armed conflict in Gaza and the idea that the United States is responsible for the terrible suffering there is just unacceptable to us, and we reject it in its totality. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Tom Fletcher. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President and members of the Security Council, today marks one of the rare times we're able to highlight positive developments, albeit amid catastrophic humanitarian needs in Gaza. The ceasefire has provided a vital reprieve from relentless hostilities for Palestinians. It has at last allowed Israeli hostages and imprisoned Palestinians to be reunited with their families. And it has enabled a massive surge in life-saving humanitarian aid into Gaza. We can save more lives if all parties continue to honor the deal. So I thank the mediators, Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, for their tireless efforts to ensure this deal is upheld. I thank them for their help to mitigate operational obstacles as they arise. Before I update the Council on what humanitarians have achieved during these first few days of the ceasefire, I must testify to what Palestinian children in Gaza have endured in the past 15 months. Mr. President, children have been killed, starved, and frozen to death. They have been maimed, orphaned, separated from their family. Conservative estimates indicate that over 17,000 children are without their families in Gaza. Some died before their first breath, perishing with their mothers in childbirth. An estimated 150,000 pregnant women and new mothers are in desperate need of health services. Children have lost their schools and their education. Those with chronic illnesses have struggled to access the care they need, many unable to do so. Many have faced sexual violence. Girls who've endured the additional indignity of no menstrual care have been left exposed and vulnerable. 1 million children are in need of mental health and psychosocial support for depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts, according to UNICEF. A generation has been traumatized. Mr. President, against the backdrop of this horror, the UN and our partners are seizing every opportunity presented by the ceasefire to step up our response across the Strip. Safe, unobstructed humanitarian access, alongside the absence of hostilities and the almost complete cessation of criminal looting over the past days, have significantly improved our ability to operate. We have been able to increase the flow of incoming supplies and deliveries, scale up storage capacity and repair work, provide life-saving services, and carry out needs and damage assessments. We are getting supplies to designated emergency shelters and distribution centers across the Gaza Strip. We are delivering food parcels and flour and working to reopen bakeries. We are distributing fuel to ensure that critical services, healthcare, water pumping, can run on backup generators in the absence of electricity. Across the spectrum, humanitarian organizations and agencies have united to meet our humanitarian goals. At the center of this, as always, is UNRWA. But we cannot do this alone. Surging high volumes of aid into Gaza requires a collective effort. All of Gaza, more than 2 million people, depends on our humanitarian support. So it is critical that the pipelines of stocks are regularly replenished, including by member states. Aid efforts must urgently be complemented by the private sector. Mr. President, while we spare no effort to scale up in Gaza, we must also keep attention on the West Bank. As we briefed this Council, since October 2023, the West Bank has witnessed record high levels of casualties, displacement, and access restrictions. These trends have intensified since the announcement of the ceasefire. Israeli settlers have attacked Palestinian villages, setting homes and properties on fire. Increased movement restrictions are impeding Palestinians' ability to access basic services and livelihoods. Mass detentions are taking place across the West Bank. Of particular concern is the situation in Jenin, where an Israeli military operation, helicopter gunfire and airstrikes alongside ground forces, has claimed lives and caused further destruction of basic infrastructure and displacement. This follows the weeks-long operation by the Palestinian Authority, during which access restrictions and confrontations with armed Palestinians triggered displacement of some 2,000 families from the camp and claimed numerous lives. Mr. President, after months without hope, we must seize this present moment. So I leave you with 3 asks. First, I urge this Council to ensure that the ceasefire is maintained. Second, I urge this Council to ensure that international law is respected across the occupied Palestinian territory of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Civilians must be protected and their essential needs must be met. All hostages must be released. Arbitrarily detained Palestinians must be freed. Detainees must be treated humanely and allowed visits by the ICRC. Civilians must be allowed to return safely to their homes. They must be able to access life-saving aid. This includes medical evacuations for the wounded and sick who need it. I urge member states to take in those patients. We need rapid, unimpeded, and safe access for the humanitarian community to be sustained. We can deliver when we are given the chance to do so. UNRWA's role is fundamental and must remain the backbone of these efforts. Restrictions on critical humanitarian items must be lifted, including items considered to be dual use. There must be accountability for atrocities in accordance with international humanitarian law. And third and finally, member states must ensure that our humanitarian operations are well funded. Our 2025 flash appeal requires $4.07 billion to meet the needs of 3 million people in Gaza and the West Bank, with nearly 90% of funds for Gaza. Funding this appeal is essential to meet massive needs and to sustain the ceasefire. Mr. President, the children of Gaza are not collateral damage. They are as deserving as children everywhere of security, education, and hope. They tell us that the world was not there for them throughout this war. We must be there for them now. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Fletcher for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Ms. Bisan Natil. You have the floor, Madam. Do you hear me, Madam Natil?
Yeah. Yes, I am.
Yes, we hear you.
Again, please.
Please, go ahead.
Say that.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Security Council. At the outset, I would like to thank you for inviting me to participate in this meeting. To tell you more about the image that you have already seen in media, the image of children who have lost their limbs, their families, the image of our displacement and our no return to our homes, the image of us losing our homes, the image of violation of all human rights of all civilians in Gaza Strip. At the outset, I would like to tell you that the war will change our life to that extent. Yet suddenly we started losing our homes. We were told, go to the safe place in South Gaza. We moved because the message was to the civilians. We went to the south. Yet once we arrived and put our luggage, the home we were close to has been attacked. This was the place claimed to be safe place. I missed introducing myself. I work with a Tamer institution. We give the children the chance through some artistic activities to express themselves, and we provide them with safe environment, free environment. Yet we lost this environment, this safety. We do not have schools or playgrounds. Everything has turned into shelters and tents. We tried to express our dreams. The children were telling us their dreams. They were dreaming of going back to their schools, not hearing the sounds of the shelling, dreaming of finding food, drink, very simple dreams. The basic necessities of life, just to eat and drink and to go to my school and go back to play with my friend. Our children have experienced serious life threats. They could not grasp the nature of these threats. They experienced the loss of home, family, and displacement through the so-called safe corridor. Their life was under threat in this safe corridor. They were forced to open their eyes and see the bodies along the road. They were forced to walk while the snipers are targeting them. We saw how they arrived unable to say a word about the horrific scene they have seen in their displacement journey. And when they reach the safe area, they are targeted. Through our work in Tamar Institution, through these activities, to express them, to help them express their dreams, we have a stream called The Dream of Return. This is Ghazi, one of the child from Al-Nawasi. Al-Nawasi is one of the areas claimed to be safe. When he was around, he drew home, drew school, drew toys. I will show you his artwork. I hope you could see it. Ghazi used to draw his father and draw himself feeling full, well-fed. But Ghazi could not transfer this image to the canvas because he was attacked in the tent. He and his father both lost their lives. The same applies to many other children who have been killed, experienced violence. They lost their families, homes, schools. Layal, one of the little girls in North Gaza, I will never forget this girl. Liane was in a shelter along with her family. This shelter was surrounded by the soldiers. The place was attacked, and the wife of her aunt was killed in this shelter and turned into pieces, and they were forced to collect their pieces to bury it. She was forced to open her eyes and see that until she and her family, until they reach Salah ad-Din and then the middle area. Can you imagine a 12-year-old girl walks long distance after these scenes of horror, violence, killing, and displacement, to go through all these psychological suffering? Can you imagine what would happen to her? All our children lost the true meanings of life, safety, security, what it means to eat, to live, to be a human. And I will never forget that throughout all this, the radio, because we have lost all means of communication. As you see, I do not have even electricity supply, and I'm trying my best to stay in touch with the world. We had this radio at the beginning of the war that we have been listening through it to Al Jazeera, Kan, the Hebrew channel, Al Arabiya, and we used to wait for the Security Council meetings to see what would be said in the Security Council. Would the Security Council reach a ceasefire? Would the massacre come to an end? Would the death come to an end? While my friend and colleague, Mohammed Sami Kreika, the artist, when he was in Al Ma'madani hospital, he was just singing and drawing with the children. He was in a hospital, Al Ma'madani hospital, one of the most important places in Gaza. We used to consider it a safe place. He was playing and singing and drawing with the children in this hospital. He and the children have been all killed in Al Ma'madani massacre. You can look it up. And you know all other incidents in Al Shifa and in other hospitals. And safe hospitals. Despite the fact that every day we lost our friends, our loved ones, our homes, our lives, we used to walk down the streets not knowing if we remain alive or die. We slept under the horrific sound of the drones and shelling. We didn't know if we were alive, dead, dreaming, or is it our life? Yet, we have always been waiting for the moment when the Security Council will announce a ceasefire to end all these massacres and violations against the Palestinians in Gaza. Today, I hope to live the ceasefire and for our children to go back to their schools and for us to go back to our normal life when we used to go to our schools, to our work, when we used to play, plant, work, the natural act of life, just to live. And I have always been thinking of the human rights. We studied in school a subject called human rights, and the first right we learned was the right to life. And the first right that was violated was our right to life. At any moment, I could be the one who survived after 1.5 years of the war. 470 days of the war. We lost count of the days as we lost sense of time as a result of the war. 470 days. In every moment, we never knew if we would live to the next moment or not. Would we breathe or not? Would we eat and drink, or would we die? Your Excellency, the President of the Security Council, Your Excellencies, I hope after 470 days of continuous attack against Gaza and against us, this attack would come to an end and we would go back to our normal life, to restore our right to life, and to have at least the basic necessities, safety, security, for the children to go back to their schools, to their life as children, to play, to draw, to sing. A normal child who lives in a normal environment, not the one who moves surrounded by soldiers, hearing weapons, and that we see in Gaza wouldn't to live a normal life. In Gaza, we don't know how life looks like out in the outside world. I know we have lost a lot in this war, and I hope we would not lose more.
شكرا لكم جميعا.
Thank you all.
I thank Mrs. Bisan Natil for her sobering briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we'd like to thank you for convening today's council meeting, supported by Algeria in a national capacity, as well as by Pakistan and Somalia. The objective being to discuss the disastrous situation of children in Gaza. We're grateful to Mr. Fletcher for taking up our invitation and participating in this briefing. We're also grateful to Ms. Bisan Natil, thanks to whom we heard a story about the tragic pages in the history of the lives of Palestinian children. Mr. President, the vile war in Gaza, involving the most intensive bombardment of civilians since World War II, and with its de facto absence of humanitarian access, has run roughshod over the lives of children in the enclave. Back in November of 2023, the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, called Gaza a graveyard of children. An assessment of the horrific consequences of massive attacks on civilians was issued by a number of Security Council members during the informal visit to the Rafah crossing in December of 2023. And back then, already, in Egypt, we saw a hospital on the border with Gaza, and there already we saw maimed children. Thanks to the efforts of Egyptian and Qatari mediators, who at a late stage were joined by representatives of the new U.S. administration, at last an agreement was reached. The agreement calls not only for a ceasefire, but also for an increase in the volumes of foodstuffs, fuel, and medicine supplied to the residents of Gaza. However, there is little cause for celebration so far. The humanitarian catastrophe raging in the enclave for over 15 months now hasn't gone away. What remains beyond the purview of the agreement are safe and unimpeded deliveries of assistance using all routes and insufficient quantities. Israel's military presence in the enclave continues. The Israeli military maintains, for instance, control over the border crossing in Rafah. As far as we understand, European monitors will be tracking the use of that crossing, thus assuming part of the responsibility for the humanitarian situation in Gaza. It's noteworthy that Europeans, who very much like to cast themselves as defenders of human rights, are not calling for those who are killing children in Gaza to be brought to justice. In fact, a number of Europeans haven't even stopped supplying weapons to Israel. The war in Gaza has truly become a litmus test, which has showed up the West's true approach to the defense of human rights. As things stand, we do not have definitive data about the number of boys and girls who have perished, because organizations working in the field cannot collect quickly enough mortality data that is not linked to wounds, but rather mortality as a result of hunger, dehydration, poor sanitation, or disruption to the work of the health sector. Collapsed buildings have not been cleared. Under the rubble, there might be thousands of bodies. Nonetheless, thanks to a recent study published by The Lancet, we do know that out of the 28,257 deaths which occurred between the 7th of October 2023 to the 30th of June 2024, for which there is age and sex data, of those 28,257, 16,699, that's roughly 59%, are women, children, and the elderly. According to UNICEF, the overall number of deaths, children's deaths since the start of the conflict, is at least 14,500. Over 17,000, roughly 17,000, are unaccompanied minors or children who have been separated from their parents. Roughly 1 million children were compelled to leave their homes. In the first 7 days of this year alone, 74 children died. In late December, early January, 8 infants in tent camps died as a result of hypothermia. Many children were also maimed in 2024 as a result of explosive weapons being used in the Gaza Strip. On average, 475 children a month, that's 15 children a day, became disabled, receiving serious injuries to their limbs or hearing problems. According to UNMAS, the UN Mine Action Service, if the war were to end today, the risk of death and being maimed for children in Gaza would remain for at least 14 years. That's how long it will take to clear the enclave of unexploded ordnance. is it worth mentioning the fact that children always were and remain the main victims of mine contamination, in part owing to children's natural curiosity. Today, we will celebrate International Day of Education. The world over, people will be talking about the fact that education is a key component of sustainable development, that everyone has a right to education. In this Palestinian enclave, in the first week of 2025 alone, schools, which people are now using inter alia as shelters, 5 attacks were waged on such schools. As a result, dozens of children suffered. At least 3 died. Gaza's education system has been paralyzed for a long time now. Assessments of the damage and destruction done to schooling facilities vary, including according to some assessments, it's up to 96% as of September 2024 and up to 100% in the north of Gaza as of December 2024. That's how many schools have been destroyed or damaged. And we're not talking about minor damage. Ceilings have collapsed. There are holes in the walls of school buildings. 625,000 students have missed an entire school year, and now they're being compelled to miss another one. It will be a miracle if these children will be able to return to school at some point. The healthcare situation has also been decimated, which has had negative repercussions on children's access to medical services. According to an OHCHR report issued on the 31st of December, that report contained a confirmation of the fact that attacks on medical facilities in Gaza have been systematic and structured. By June of 2024, 22 out of 38 hospitals had stopped operating. According to WHO data, only 38% of primary healthcare centers are functional. Under such conditions, what has again been proven to be irreplaceable and unique is UNRWA. UNRWA's activities in the occupied Palestinian territory is under risk of being banned owing to the laws adopted by the Knesset. These decisions are not only in violation of international humanitarian law, they also violate the 1946 Convention on Privileges and Immunities of UN Personnel. And in fact, it is the Secretary General of the United Nations who is the guarantor of the implementation of this convention. Such decisions are also at odds with the relevant UNGA decisions, as well as the conditions for Israel's membership in the UN since 1949. That is the implementation of 2 flagship UNGA resolutions, Resolution 181, the Partition Plan of Palestine, and 194 about Palestine refugees. For over 70 years, UNRWA staff have worked under inhumane conditions, often risking their lives to implement the agency's mandate, which includes the provision of educational, healthcare, social, microfinancing, and emergency assistance services to Palestinians in need. The mandate also includes the improvement of infrastructure and the living conditions of refugees in camps. For the last 15 months, over the course of the last 15 months, 265 UNRWA personnel have died. This is a record loss of UN staff in the entire history of the organization. The stoppage of UNRWA's work would have catastrophic consequences for the most vulnerable groups, first and foremost children. We simply cannot allow that to happen. Under such conditions, the ceasefire should be used to urgently scale up humanitarian assistance to the region, placing the emphasis on the particular needs of children. Aside from efforts aimed at rebuilding infrastructure, delivering food and medicine, we also need to ensure unimpeded evacuation from the enclave of children who require specialized assistance. They should be evacuated together with their parents or guardians, as well as granted unimpeded return home. Another component of the agreement that was reached is an exchange of all detainees, among which there are children. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. The issue of arbitrary detentions by the Israeli authorities of Palestinian children existed long before the events of 7th October 2023. They were subjected to so-called administrative detention, just like adults. As a result, they ended up behind bars for unspecified periods of time without being charged with anything. We shouldn't forget about repeat detention of minors who were released following a similar deal reached in November of 2023. The war in Gaza has not only disfigured the fates of children and adults, it has also torn apart the fabric of society, delaying until further notice the start of genuine peaceful coexistence of the two peoples. Even those children in Gaza who were lucky enough to remain alive, to not be disabled, they will also need years in order to fix their psychiatric health and to learn to live like their peers are living in other regions not affected by conflict. Another acute issue is Palestinian orphans, of which there are over 20,000. What does fate have in store for them? What can the UN do to ensure that the lives of these children are not broken? Sustainable stabilization of the situation in Gaza is the only option. There is no alternative if we want to secure the future of Palestinian children and thus of the Palestinian people as a whole. We believe that the Security Council is simply duty-bound to keep this issue, children, front of mind in the context of the situation in Gaza. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Undersecretary General Tom Fletcher, for your briefing, and to Ms. Bisan Natil for your moving remarks. Colleagues, a ceasefire and hostage release deal were long overdue. The United States, Qatar, and Egypt-led mediation finally led to an agreement to end the conflict Hamas set into motion on October 7th, 2023. The deal halted the fighting in Gaza, and it will reunite all of the remaining hostages with their families and will surge much-needed humanitarian assistance to Palestinian civilians. We remind this Council that Hamas still holds 2 children hostage, Kafir and Ariel Bibas, who were violently taken from their home on October 7th. 2-year-old Kafir has marked both of his birthdays in Hamas captivity. Since Hamas's barbaric attack started this conflict over 15 months ago, the suffering of Palestinian civilians, the deaths and the injuries and the displacement has been immense. The suffering extends to Gaza's youngest victims, the Palestinian children who were caught in the crossfire, lost family, missed school. No one benefits from this crisis. Now is the time to ensure critical aid reaches those in need throughout Gaza in accordance with the ceasefire deal the United States, Qatar, and Egypt secured. We urge countries to support this effort through additional funding and resources to help quickly scale up much-needed humanitarian aid. We must ensure that Hamas is not permitted to seize, divert, or profit from this assistance, and that if it does so, it is reported immediately. Hamas cannot be allowed to reconstitute. Hamas should have no role in the governance of Gaza. It should not be rewarded for having launched the brutal attack that started this conflict or for its deplorable behavior in the interim. We must instead seize this opportunity to reshape the region in a way that affords its people a path forward. Gaza must be demilitarized for the sake of Israel's security and to provide a brighter future for the Palestinian people. Hamas, along with its benefactors in Tehran, should not have a say in the region's future. We have already seen Hamas weaponize the suffering of Palestinians by using civilian infrastructure, including schools and hospitals, to store caches of weapons, house fighters, and coordinate attacks against Israel. We are concerned about reports that Hamas held returned Israeli hostages in UN shelters in Gaza during their prolonged captivity. It is vital for a full investigation to assess these very serious allegations. At the same time, Hamas plays the victim and makes false appeals to the international community on behalf of Palestinians, while at the same time employing tactics that put them in danger. Israelis need to feel secure within their own borders, and Palestinians deserve a future to look forward to with freedom, dignity, and security. We must work together to counter the nefarious influence of Tehran and its terrorist proxies, whose actions have destabilized the Middle East for decades. We can instead work with like-minded partners to create a Middle East that is more integrated, prosperous, and peaceful. The United States is strongly committed to implementing the ceasefire agreement so that hostages can return home and the people of Gaza can look forward to a brighter future under new leadership. This is the only path forward. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，
President, I thank U.S. Chief Fletcher and Ms. Natil for their briefings. Children are the greatest victims of armed conflict. During the 15-month-long Gaza conflict, at least 17,000 Palestinian children have been killed, with more than 600,000 plunged into an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. Those children who should have been sitting in the classrooms learning with books in their hands had instead found themselves facing forced displacement again and again and huddling under the rubble to seek shelter from the bombardment. Scenes of children dying in front of their family and images of children reduced to skin and bones due to malnutrition have broken our heart. All this should have never happened and must not be allowed to continue. The international community must act to put an end to the suffering of the children of Gaza. First, a durable ceasefire in Gaza. Once the ceasefire that began on January the 19th has been fulfilled, there must be no resumption of fighting, and the children must not once again be put under gunpoint or subjected to gunfire. The current ceasefire should form the basis for a permanent ceasefire rather than a pause before a new round of offensive. We are gravely concerned about reports that children were shot and killed by Israeli forces in Rafah the day after the ceasefire came into effect. We strongly call for the continuous and full implementation of the three-phase ceasefire agreement. Second, expand humanitarian assistance in Gaza. Children in Gaza have long been deprived of the basic necessities for survival, such as food and medicine, and there are even cases of newborn babies being frozen to death. We call on Israel to fulfill its obligation under the international humanitarian law as the occupying power by opening all border crossings, lifting restrictions on entry of goods, and guaranteeing large-scale access of humanitarian supplies into Gaza and their safe and orderly distribution. We call on the international community to scale up their assistance to Gaza. Third, guaranteeing education for children in Gaza. Education is indispensable for the healthy development of children. 15 months of indiscriminate bombing have obliterated the conditions of living in Gaza, with education being completely disrupted. The international community should support the expeditious commencement of reconstruction in Gaza to restore people's livelihoods and provide children with a healthy environment in which to grow up. For years, UNRWA has been providing basic public services such as education in Gaza, and as such has the capacity and should play a major role in the post-war reconstruction of Gaza. We once again call on Israel to cease its suppression of the agency and to repeal the relevant bill as soon as possible. Fourth, accountability for violations against children. Protection of civilians in armed conflict is an obligation under international law, and not targeting children even more so. The Security Council resolution has clearly identified 6 grave violations against children as prohibited actions. However, large amount of reporting has shown that children in Gaza have suffered grave violations during the conflict, and the annual report of the Secretary-General has also listed relevant perpetrators. We call for investigations and accountability for all violations against children in all conflicts and support the continued focus on the children of Gaza by the Council's Working Group on Children and Armed Conflict. President,
The fundamental approach to allow Palestinian children to grow up in a safe and healthy environment is through the implementation of the two-state solution and the realization of a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the question of Palestine. The international community must act with an utmost sense of urgency to promote the restart of the political process for the two-state solution. China is ready to continue to make unremitting efforts with all parties to promote an early realization of peaceful coexistence between Palestine and Israel and a lasting peace and security in the Middle East, so that the children of both Palestine and Israel can be free from the horrors of war and grow up freely under the sunshine of peace. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Mr. President, Panama welcomes the convening of this meeting in response to the request made by the Russian Federation, Algeria, Pakistan and Somalia to address the situation of the children in the Gaza Strip under the agenda item Children and Armed Conflicts. We thank the briefers, the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Tom Fletcher, Ms. Bisan Natil of the Tamer Institute for Community Education. We thank them for their invaluable briefings. Moreover, we welcome the delegations of Egypt, Israel, and the Observer State of Palestine to this meeting. We here would like to convey our gratitude to the humanitarian agencies who, in bitterly difficult conditions, work tirelessly to protect and guarantee the well-being of the communities most affected by the conflict. The recent ceasefire between Hamas and Israel offers an admirable opportunity to address the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. However, UN reports are clear. More than 14,500 Palestinian children have lost their lives. Another 25,000 are wounded, and around 1 million have been displaced. We bitterly regret the loss of these innocent lives. According to UNICEF, approximately 88% of schools in Gaza require total reconstruction or significant repairs. Their current state of disrepair is affecting more than 625,000 students. Moreover, only 25% of drinking water production facilities are operational. That has caused cases of waterborne illnesses to skyrocket. Healthcare infrastructure has also suffered severe damage. Myriad hospitals are no longer functional, and that has worsened the public health crisis. Panama once again condemns the abduction of Israeli children by Hamas. That was an inhumane act which constitutes a grave violation of international humanitarian law. These children have been used as bargaining chips in a cruel and unacceptable strategy. It is with deep regret that we, in this conflict, as in so many other armed conflicts, decry the tragic loss of young life, all young life, and we reaffirm that the protection of children should be comprehensive and without exception. We urge this Council to continue always to champion efforts which guarantee that all children receive the care and protection they deserve. Against this backdrop, Panama welcomes the adoption of Resolution 2764 of the Security Council. It was adopted in December. The resolution reaffirms the obligation that all parties have to uphold international humanitarian law, in particular the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Moreover, we recall the importance of adhering to the provisions of Resolution 1612, 1882, 2225 and 2601 adopted by this Council. These resolutions have established a robust framework for the protection of children in armed conflicts. Faced with the alarming situation of children in Gaza, which can in no way be justified, Panama proposes the following actions as priorities in order to meet their most pressing needs. 1. Guarantee unfettered humanitarian access through the sustained and efficient opening of crossing points in order to allow the safe and unimpeded delivery of essential commodities, including water, food, medicines and fuel. It's also fundamental to guarantee the safety of humanitarian personnel on the ground. The process already underway, fortunately, to ensure the daily arrival of at least 500 trucks is pivotal in order to meet the urgent needs of the people affected. 2. Protect children effectively, this through the implementation of mechanisms which safeguard their lives and well-being, mechanisms which ensure their access to healthcare, safe harbour and psychosocial assistance. Rehabilitation programmes must begin as a matter of urgency and must adopt a comprehensive approach, an approach which includes both physical and mental health care for children. It is estimated that around 17,000 children have been separated from their families in Gaza and require immediate specialised assistance. 3. Rebuild as a matter of urgency critical infrastructure. Efforts should even more urgently focus on restoring schools, hospitals and water systems in order to guarantee safe and enabling environments for children's development. Investment in education is clear to avoid losing a generation, bearing in mind that 496 schools have been damaged or destroyed. The effective coordination of these efforts will allow children to resume their education and restore their access to core services, and that will allow them to move towards a future of hope. 4. We should decisively support UN agencies, specifically UNICEF and UNRWA, whose role has been crucial in delivering humanitarian assistance to Gaza, and must continue to be so. The current situation of UNRWA, with the agency facing operational restrictions and critical funding shortfalls, imperils the delivery of essential services to millions of Palestinian refugees. Panama underscores the fact that we must guarantee the safety of UNRWA personnel. We must ensure respect for their international mandate and provide the necessary financing to allow them to continue playing their crucial role in the region. Mr. President, the crisis in Gaza stands as an urgent reminder of our collective responsibility towards the most vulnerable. We cannot allow indifference or political differences to stymie efforts to protect the children trapped in this conflict. Children traumatized by war cannot continue paying the price of inaction. With every day that passes without a solution being found, the suffering of the children increases and their dreams of a safe future fade. Let us act with courage, humanity and resolve in order to ensure that the world does not forget the faces of these children, nor the duty that we all have towards them. We cannot change the past, but we can and we must decide the future that we want to build for them. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank USG Fletcher and Ms. Natil for their briefing, and I welcome the participation of the Observer State of Palestine, Israel and Egypt in this meeting. Let me make 3 points. First, following the terror attacks of 7 October and 15 months of appalling conflict, we stand with Palestinians and Israelis in relief and hope that the ceasefire and hostage release deal can bring lasting peace. The children of Gaza did not choose this war, yet they have paid the ultimate price. A third of identified bodies are children. At least 21,500 children are thought to have sustained injuries, and in the last 4 months of 2024, nearly 19,000 children were hospitalised with acute malnutrition. Gaza has become the deadliest place in the world to be a child. The psychological scars of fear, pain and deprivation are clear. Nearly half the Palestinian children surveyed by one NGO in late 2024 expressed a desire to die. That is a truly shocking statistic. We must ensure that the needs of children are front and centre of efforts to rebuild in Gaza. As this Council heard in September from Dr. Harlev of the Schneider Children's Medical Centre, the events of 7 October also exacted a dreadful toll on Israeli children who were killed, gravely injured and abducted, some of whom have still not returned to their loved ones. It is unimaginably cruel of Hamas to take children hostage and still to be holding them a full 15 months later. They must be released. Second, President, we welcome news that aid is now flowing in at scale. And as USG Fletcher said, this must continue. Humanitarian actors must be allowed safe and unfettered access throughout Gaza, including the north. And alongside this, we need to see a massive increase in commercial delivery. The rollout of the polio vaccine to children in Gaza last year was an example of what can be achieved when there is political will. We urge the parties to enter this new phase in that same spirit and to prioritise those in desperate need. The ceasefire deal should be an opportunity to get more, not less, aid in. And for this reason, my Foreign Secretary has urged Israel to ensure UNRWA can continue its life-saving operations and give the fragile ceasefire the best chance of success. Finally, the conflict has meant that the 1.1 million children of Gaza have been out of school for over 15 months. We cannot allow a generation of Palestinians to be deprived of education and their right to a better future. To do so risks further suffering and a continued cycle of violence. This is in neither Palestinian nor Israeli interests. Once again, UNRWA plays a crucial role here. We must ensure its delivery of essential services, such as education and healthcare, can continue until such time as a Palestinian state can take over these functions. President, in conclusion, this Council has a clear children and armed conflict mandate to ensure that we protect children from the scourge of war and violence, wherever that may be. And yet grave violations against children are at an all-time high. We must do much more to reverse this appalling trajectory. We call on all parties to adopt and implement concrete and time-bound action plans to end and prevent grave violations against children. The United Kingdom will do all we can to turn the current ceasefire in Gaza into a lasting peace based on a two-state solution, where Palestinian and Israeli children alike can enjoy a safe and prosperous future. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I thank USG Fletcher for his briefing and Ms. Bissan Natil for her sobering testimony. The subject of today's meeting reminds us of the worst consequences of war, the devastating impacts on children. It reminds us of why peace must always be the only choice. Over the past 15 months, we, the members of this Council, and indeed the entire world, have watched the children in Gaza bear the brunt of war that no child should ever experience. more than 14,500 of them were killed, and thousands more injured and maimed for life. Gaza is now the place with the highest number of child amputees in modern history. Children lost limbs, suffered severe burns, and their fragile bones were broken and crushed as Israeli airstrikes and bombs destroyed their homes, the places where they played, and ravaged all the spaces where they sought shelter, in gross violation of international law. Many lost their parents, their siblings, and other beloved family members. They were displaced multiple times, traveling from place to place, often in harsh weather conditions, but finding nowhere truly safe. In December alone, 8 infants and newborns reportedly died from hypothermia. It is reported that more than 30,000 children were orphaned and nearly 1 million displaced from their homes. In this unrelenting war, children in Gaza were denied access to water and food and suffered malnutrition, with famine a real risk for many. In the absence of basic sanitation, thousands fell sick, suffering from preventable diseases with no recourse to health care, as hospital after hospital was bombed and medical personnel attacked and terrorized. Previously eradicated diseases such as polio re-emerged as vaccination programs fell behind. Schools in Gaza were not spared by Israel's weapons. They were reduced to rubble, erasing the hopes, dreams, and educational aspirations of the students. UNICEF reports that 95% of Gaza's school buildings have been damaged or destroyed. With the acquired ability to identify the various types of weaponry used through the ominous sounds of war, children in Gaza have witnessed the worst atrocities and endured tremendous suffering. The trauma and scars of the past months on their bodies and minds will endure for their lifetime. Mr. President, Guyana welcomes the current ceasefire, which offers much-needed reprieve for the people of Gaza, particularly the children. We urge all parties to work assiduously to ensure that it holds and that it becomes permanent. The protection of children in Gaza must be a priority during the implementation of the ceasefire. They must have shelter, the necessary humanitarian aid and health care, including psychosocial support. Access to education must return as soon as possible, with attention paid to explosive ordnance clearance and risk education to ensure their safety. Mr. President, the ordeal of Gaza's children is far from over. Families are returning to new horrors in their communities, discovering flattened or gutted homes and pulling decayed bodies from the rubble. The reconstruction and rehabilitation process will be long, expensive, and arduous, requiring the collective support and resources of the international community. Crucial to these efforts is the continued functioning of UNRWA. It has been emphasized in numerous briefings to this Council that UNRWA is the only agency in Gaza with the capacity and reach to provide a wide range of support needed by civilians in Gaza. Guyana reiterates its call for Israel to not implement the law on UNRWA and respect the mandate given to UNRWA by the UN General Assembly. We thank all UN agencies, including UNRWA, and the numerous NGOs for their indefatigable efforts in providing life-saving support to children in Gaza, never giving up, even in the most difficult circumstances. They must be given the requisite support by this Council and the international community to continue their critical work. Mr. President, it is necessary to touch on another issue as we discuss today's subject, that of accountability, which was also mentioned by USG Fletcher. As the war on Gaza dragged on, the undertakings and assurances given to the world's children in legally binding international instruments and under the umbrella of international law were eroded one by one in Gaza. This Council, in Resolution 1261 and subsequent Children in Armed Conflict resolutions, was united in identifying 6 grave violations against children in situations of armed conflict, calling on parties to ensure the protection of children and for accountability for violations. Children in Gaza were subject to these grave violations. There has been blatant disregard for international humanitarian law and widespread human rights abuses. Guyana is of the firm view that impunity and the failure to hold perpetrators of grave violations against children accountable are contributing to the increase in such violations worldwide. Those in breach must be held accountable. This Council must be consistent and united in demanding that all parties to conflicts adhere to their obligations under international law to protect children. The children in Gaza deserve no less. In closing, Mr. President, I reiterate that peaceful resolution of conflicts remains the best and only real protection for children. We must, therefore, spare no effort to end this conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank you for convening this briefing at the request of the Russian Federation, supported by Algeria in its national capacity, Pakistan, and Somalia, focused on the deeply alarming situation of children in the occupied Palestinian territory. I thank Undersecretary General Tom Fletcher for his briefing, as well as Ms. Pisa Natil for a compelling contribution. Sierra Leone commends UN agencies and other partners on the ground in the Gaza Strip for their tireless effort to protect and support children affected by the conflict in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. Sierra Leone stands in solidarity with every child affected by this conflict, those who have been tragically killed, those buried under rubble, those maimed and injured, those held hostage in prison or captive for months without proper care, and those who have been orphaned. Let us remember these children not only with sorrow, but also with renewed determination to resolve the conflict that has caused them such immense suffering. Mr. President, at the heart of the conflict in Gaza are the civilians who bear the brunt of this violence. Today's briefing have underscored the profound impact the conflict is having on children, many of whom have known only a life of violence and insecurity. The current ceasefire, while bringing some relief, cannot mask the dire conditions that these children continue to face. For over a year, children in Gaza have endured unimaginable hardship, deprivation, bombardment, and displacement. Since October 7, 2023, it is reported that at least 14,500 children have lost their lives, with an estimated 25,000 injured. Over 17,000 children have been separated from their parents, and nearly 1 million have been displaced from their homes. Many are still unaccounted for. Disturbing reports indicate that newborns have died from harsh winter conditions, inadequate shelter, and the unavailability of life-saving formula. These numbers add to the 1,434 Palestinian children killed and 32,175 injured between 2008 and October 6, 2024, as per the UNHCR. The relentless attacks on densely populated areas, the constant displacement, and the disruption of essential services have subjected countless children to grave violations of their rights, killing, maiming, and the destruction of schools, hospitals, water, and energy infrastructure. The targeting of schools, now used as shelters, have left children with no safe spaces for learning or recovery. This has contributed to the erosion of the social fabric of a once resilient society. The effects of this war on children will endure long after the fighting stops, leaving lasting physical and psychological scars. As the ongoing situation in Gaza continues to highlight the vulnerability of children in conflict zones, it is essential that we take urgent and effective action to safeguard this generation from further calamity. In this regard, Sierra Leone would like to emphasize the following points. First, we urge all parties to fully adhere to the ceasefire agreement and take all necessary steps to protect children's rights. We deeply regret attacks on schools and hospitals, and that the Safe Schools Declaration was not upheld. As noted by Undersecretary General Fletcher, with the ceasefire in place, humanitarian agencies and partners are scaling up efforts to address the health and psychosocial needs of children, including specialized protection services for unaccompanied children. This vital work must be supported and expanded as part of Gaza's rebuilding process and the broader reconstruction of the occupied Palestinian territory. Second, in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2712, we call on all parties to comply with their obligations under international law for the protection of children in armed conflict, including the Geneva Conventions, the Convention on the Right of the Child, and all relevant legal frameworks. The adoption of Resolution 2712 by this Council acknowledges the disproportionate impact on children and demands that all parties ensure children receive the special protection they are entitled to under international law. Third, in line with Resolution 2720 and other relevant resolutions, Sierra Leone reiterates the call for Israel as the occupying power to ensure the safe, sustained, and unimpeded access of humanitarian aid into Gaza. We welcome the entry of approximately 2,400 aid trucks since the beginning of the ceasefire and encourage further support for these efforts. We also call on all parties to support humanitarian organizations in facilitating the emergency medical evacuation of critically injured civilians, including thousands of children. The risk posed by explosive remnants of war remain high, and we urge all stakeholders to ensure the safe disposal of these ordinances to prevent further harm to civilians, especially children. Last but not least, we affirm the critical role of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, in meeting the humanitarian needs of the civilian population in Gaza, particularly in providing education, health services, and psychosocial support for children. Rebuilding educational infrastructure must be a top priority to ensure that children can resume learning in a safe environment that fosters both academic development and emotional healing. In conclusion, it is imperative that we strengthen accountability mechanisms for violation of children's rights, including holding perpetrators accountable for attacks on schools and hospitals, the denial of humanitarian access, and the use of sexual violence against children in conflict. We call for the release of all children being held in detention camps and for full and impartial investigations into their detentions. As we welcome the ceasefire as a crucial step towards rebuilding Gaza and addressing the immediate needs of its children, we also urge swift action to end the ongoing military operations in the West Bank, which has resulted in fatalities and injuries. Reports of violence between settlers and the Palestinian communities must be addressed to ensure that the ceasefire leads to lasting peace and stability. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to thank the Algerian presidency and yourself for convening this briefing on the request of the Russian Federation, Somalia, Sierra Leone, and my own delegation on the plight of children in Gaza. We thank Mr. Tom Fletcher for his briefing, and in particular I would like to thank Ms. Wissam Natil for her testimony of the suffering that the children of Gaza have endured for the past 15 months. Mr. President, Israel's unrelenting and indiscriminate attacks on the civilian population in Gaza for 15 sustained months with one pause cannot be justified by any argument of the provocation that instigated these attacks. International humanitarian law is quite clear, crystal clear, that no matter what the provocation, the forces of a state are prohibited from attacking civilian structures or even structures where there may be civilians that could suffer as a result of these attacks. This principle has to be upheld if we are today and in the future to be able to contain the consequences of wars and conflicts on innocent people. That was the purpose of the Geneva Conventions. And that purpose was set out after the wars that devastated Europe and the world. And today, that purpose must be reinstated as we see the suffering that has been caused by Israel's brutal and indiscriminate war in Gaza. 46,000 people killed, most of them women and children. How can this be justified? Among the tragedies of the Palestinian people, the suffering of the children in Gaza stands out as a black mark on humanity at large. Not only on those who caused the suffering by their bombs and artillery, not only on those who allowed this to happen over 15 months, that this Security Council remained frozen because of the position of certain states. Not only those who continued to supply weapons and ammunition to the attacking forces who were killing children every day, but even all of us. And I'm glad I was not on the Security Council, Mr. President, last year, and that I come on the Council at a time when a ceasefire has been achieved, however fragile. But this deliberate policy of targeting civilians, irrespective of the fact that the majority being killed are children and women, hospitals attacked, schools attacked, children targeted by snipers,